These are the 5 segmented base plate designs that will be described and produced in this video. Good morning, I'm Jobin here from Accu-Slice. This video will be part 1 of a new video series on the development of base plates for segmented bowls. These rings can be used as base plates for segmented bowls such as this, or this project, very similar. Also, it can be used for tops and bottoms of eggs, and also tops of some of the bells we've produced in the past. Now, I know we've all made projects in the past, such as this bowl I made probably about 6 years ago. And I made this and came out quite nice, but like a year and a half after I made it, lo and behold, the bottom cracked. So that was one project. I had another project here, same thing. Nice little bowl I made, and it got some minor cracks in the bottom of the bowl. And the reason these crack is because when you have a segmented ring, such as this, if that wood expands and contracts a little bit, it can enlarge and move and have a minimal chance of cracking. Also, by staggering your joints, you can eliminate the cracking. But when you have a segmented ring in the center of a bowl, which is trapped on all sides, enlarges or gets smaller due to just natural moisture in the air, there's no place for it to go. So something has to give. So what happens is the joints crack. That's what happened on some of these projects. So in this video series, I'll be looking to develop some segmented rings for the bottoms of bowls and minimizing the chance of these cracking. And I'm using 2 ideas to minimize that cracking. Number 1, the more segments you have per ring, the less chance of cracking. And the smaller the segments, the less chance of cracking. And also using some ideas of staggering joints more to minimize cracking. So all these ideas can be used to produce some new and unique designs for the bottoms of your bowls. So this video will be part 1 of this video series on the development of these base plates for segmented bowls. I'll also be producing another video series on segmented rings. Okay, again, designing some unique designs and shapes for segmented rings for your various projects. So I'm going to begin with a very simple segmented ring for the bowl, using our Accu-Wedge system to produce some segmented pieces, all going to a perfect point in the center. Next, I'm going to be making a board with alternating purple heart and maple in the base. Again, going to a perfect point in the center. I ran these both through the board sander to get an exact same thickness and the exact same width, so they're matching boards. So once I get one set up, the other board will be exactly the same. Let's run the maple first. And again, I'm looking to get a board to go into a perfect point in the center. Well, I'm now ready to make a bunch of segmented rings, all go into a perfect point in the center. And again, I'm making 18 segments per ring, which is becoming my standard size segmented rings. As I mentioned earlier, the more segments you get per ring, the less chance of splitting of the joints. If you have a segment ring with like 8 segments, they're bigger pieces of wood, and there's more chance they might crack on you. But again, getting more segments per ring makes it harder to get them to go into a perfect point in the center. So you're always compromising. But I'm able to do 18. That's probably about the maximum number of segments I can get per ring to get a perfect point in the center. So I have my system set to 18 segments per ring. I'm using the Accu-Wedge mounted on my bandsaw. This is on my Laguna bandsaw, mounted on my mounting plate. I can use it either on the mounting plate kit or mounted on my Accu-Slice index table. I actually prefer the mounting plate kit because it has double shields for sawdust, so the bearings don't get clogged up near as easily with this system. But it works perfectly well on both systems, both this system and the Accu-Slice system. So my system is set up for 18 segments per ring. I'll be cutting a bunch of segments. This piece of maple, let's make some white ones. Making the segmented ring go into a perfect point in the center is probably the most difficult cut to make on the bandsaw. So what happens is when you're cutting this wedge, if the blade hits on this outside surface, that causes the blade to warp out and you get an inaccurate cut. If it's too far in, then you don't have a solid point in the center, you have a hole in the center. So you have to get this really accurate. And I really found the best way to do this is to adjust it such that when you push, make your first cut on, on this side of the board, and then when you're here on this side of the board, when you push the board against your bandsaw blade, you just want to feel the teeth on the outside of the board. It's a pretty close, cut. But just be able to feel those teeth on the outside of the blade seems to be a pretty good point to cut. I took a couple of pictures here. This is showing the bandsaw blade from the back side, where it's just on the edge of the tip of the board. And you might be able to see the teeth on the blade on the outside edge are just parallel to that flat surface on that slant on the edge of the board. When you cut the board, you want to get a perfect point on this edge of the board. And then you can fine adjust your stop to get that accurate position. So I push my board now. What I do too is I usually sand my edge to get the fuzzies off the edge, always using clamps. And I get my board, get my getting my stop as close to the blade as I can get it, but allowing room for my ramp here to push the boards away. And then always center the board in the center, making sure it's tight against the fence and clamping down. And always use clamps. You cannot hold this by hand, it'll move on you. So you have to use clamps. But again, centered in the middle of my Accu-Stop, tight against the sled, tight against the stop, and clamped in place. And then being able to just feel those edges of the bandsaw blade. But that should be pretty good. And again, I have a line marked on my board, offset, because when these line up, because when I put my pieces together, I want these lines all facing up, so my rings are always with the same side of the board facing up. So I'm ready to cut now. Against the stop, clamped in place, pushed down tight, tight against the fence, and going back and forth between the two fences. And both set at 18 segments per ring. And I set it between each of the cuts. But going from this fence to this fence, I'll sand the edge. But going from here to here, I don't need a sanded edge, but going from this fence to this fence, I have to sand the fuzzies off the edge. One thing I want to mention, to get perfect wedges, make sure you watch the video on our website, which is called Cutting Perfect Wedges with the Accu-Wedge System. There's a lot of good pointers in there to get perfect wedges. For one thing, you make sure your blades are 3/4 inch wide, you can't use a 1/2 inch wide blade. It has to be 3/4 inch wide and either 10 or 14 teeth per inch. I prefer the 3/4 inch wide blade, 14 teeth per inch. And again, cutting very slowly, always making sure you use the clamps, making sure it's clamped against the fence, make sure your board is nice and straight. So a lot of other good pointers in that video to watch to get perfect wedges. This part of the video is shown at 5 times the actual cutting speed for viewing purposes. But actually you want to cut as slow as possible. The slower you cut, the smoother the cut. And also making sure I sand that front edge when I go from the right fence to the left fence, just to make sure there's no fuzzies to interfere with the alignment. So once again, I'll go sand the fuzzies off these and we'll see what they look like. Yeah, I've demonstrated sanding these in the past. And one thing you watch, you don't chip the front edge here. And try and keep that clean. But you gotta get rid of the burr on the one side, and of course the fuzzies on the bottom. So I use just by sanding backwards like this. I continue sanding the remaining segments and then assemble those into a pattern, again with the lines always facing upwards and alternating from the front to the back as shown here. In a likewise manner, I cut the segments of the Purple Heart wood for this project. And after sanding, these are the two resulting segmented discs. I also cut a series of larger Purple Heart wedges from a 1.5 inch square Purple Heart board, which will be used to produce some larger base rings for this project. I will later assemble these wedges to produce a 5-inch diameter bottom or base ring into which the segmented rings will be inserted. Okay, I'm ready to start gluing up my segmented disc, all going to a perfect point in the center. And I'm using my Dizzy glue up jig to support these pieces as I'm gluing them up. And I put a plastic round disc first to put the segmented disc on, and I'm applying glue to both sides of each of the wedges. And this video is sped up 4 times the actual speed, again for viewing purposes. So after all the wedges have been glued, I then use rubber bands to clamp the segments in place. I like using rubber bands because they give nice even pressure around all the disc, and you don't have any high spots, so everything's nice and straight. And I double check it out as I'm doing it, adding additional rubber bands as needed, wiping off the excess glue, and just making sure everything is nice and tight and going to a perfect point in the center. Then I put my clamps back on my Dizzy glue up jig just to keep it in place while I apply a clamp so it doesn't slip and slide. I put a next plastic disc on top and then use a clamp to clamp everything down nice and tight, and let that dry for at least an hour. Okay, after taking off the rubber bands and cleaning these up on my disc sander to see the resulting disc, these will be the bases. Yeah, they came out pretty good. And what I'm going to be doing here is going to be taking these discs and slicing them into slices like 50,000 of an inch thick, and then gluing them back together, rotating them each a half a turn. And then those will get inserted into the base. And when I curve this out, when I put it on the lathe and curve it out, hopefully by those layers being rotated, you get some unique patterns. So the next step will be to glue these bases onto a chuck for the lathe, turning out the diameter here so that my pieces will fit in, and then also cutting these on my Accu-Slice system into the thin layers. So that's the next step, is gluing these up and then cutting these and then gluing those back together. I have a faceplate on my lathe with a wooden block attached to it. So this is my base piece. I insert it into a chuck and hold it in place. Then I have a rotating tailstock on my lathe. And after I put some glue on here, I'll put it back on the tailstock. I did put a piece of paper down on my lathe bed so I don't get glue on the lathe bed. And let's screw this in place. And later I'll be using the same tailstock, this rotating tailstock, to align subsequent layers, because this enables me to move the layers to line up my segments. Okay, now let that dry for at least a half an hour. I have an Accu-Slice system attached to my bandsaw with a carriage, and next I have to glue one of my segmented blocks to a sacrificial fence. I'll let that dry for at least half an hour, and then I'll attach it to my carriage. Okay, my board's been glued to the sacrificial fence, and I did put a mark on the board. This is the line that's put on the board. And that's for alignment later when I glue these back together. You know, there's a chance that these things could be off, a few thousandths, and I want to make sure you get them aligned properly so they all line up nice. So that's why I put this line on here, and it's not in the center of the segment, but it's off center. That way I make sure I don't get them reversed, forward and backward. So this gets attached to the carriage next with some screws. I just align my board so my board just touches the inside of my blade, and I reset my scale to 0, and for my first cut I'll advance this 1 turn, which is 50 thousandths for the thickness of my blade, and then 1 additional turn of 50 thousandths for the thickness of the board I want to cut. So make sure these are locked and these are unlocked. So that's one full turn for the curve of the blade, and then one full turn to give me a board 50,000 inch thick. The cutting of these discs is actually shown at 5 times the actual cutting speed, because again, the slower you cut, the smoother it cuts. And I'm using a 10 teeth per inch blade to cut these discs. And once again, to cut the next board, I advance the index wheel 2 turns. Again, one for the curve of the blade, and another turn to give me a board 50,000 inch thick. And I just moved the video camera so you can see exactly how the pieces are being cut off the segmented disc. And I do slice all the way down to the MDF board, so I don't waste any of the segmented discs that I've glued up. So there I have 7 discs. So the next step is to glue these together, rotating each one a half a segment. The other thing you can see on here, you can see the black mark, and that's so I keep the orientation correct. You know, if I was to get one of these reversed, right away I'd be able to see that, so I can make sure they're all aligned exactly the same. So I said the next thing is to glue these together, rotating each one half a segment, so it looks something like this when it's done. So it looks something like that when it's done. I'm ready to start gluing up my disc that I cut, and I have 2, 3, 4, I got 8 of these segmented discs. And on the bottom, I'm putting a thicker piece of just, this is again an 18 segment yellow or purple heart, about 100,000 inch thick, just to give me a stronger base. And what I want to be doing now is staggering my joints. So even on this base, I'll be staggering the joint. I also have my index marks. I want to keep those aligned as I go along. So let me. I apply glue to both sides of the disc, and then align the disc, rotating each disc a half a segment, and continuing to add additional disc until all the discs have been inserted and glued together. After all the discs have been glued, I then double check my alignment, make sure everything is correctly aligned, insert a plastic disc on top of the disc, and then use 4 clamps to clamp the disc in place. And then I can add a C-clamp to the center just to make sure I get good, even pressure. Okay, let that dry for at least half an hour. Okay, this is a different style of the segmented disc, in which I have 2 white, then a purple heart, and 2 white. So instead of alternating, I doubled up on the whites, just to give a different pattern. Same thing, I have a purple heart base, about 100,000 inch, not about 150,000 inch thick. I glue these up in the same manner as previously, applying glue to both sides of the disc, aligning, and also making sure my black marks are aligned as I continue adding the various discs. And then put a plastic disc on top once again, some clamps, and then clamping everything in place and let it dry. Okay, this one's a little bit different. I have my base plate again, my purple heart, and I have my alternating segments. And between the layers, I'm going to put these solid purple heart disc. So we'll see how that looks. So I first applied glue to my segmented purple heart disc. Then I have my first segmented disc layer, and making sure the joints are alternating. And then I add the solid purple heart disc, followed by the segmented disc, and alternate that back and forth until all the discs have been glued together. Now these are the 5 segmented discs that I just finished gluing up. Again, these all have 18 segments per layer. And starting off with this one, which I have my 18 segments, alternating colors. And then I cut this into thin strips, 50,000 inch thick, and glue them back together, rotating each one a half a segment, so they go in a circular pattern. And likewise manner, this is the same 18 segments, but instead of rotating them, counterclockwise, I just stagger them back and forth. So you see the difference. So they should give different patterns when I put these on a lathe. So what I'll be doing when I put this on the lathe is I'll be, scooping out the center here and exposing those bottom layers. So see what kind of interesting patterns we might get out of that. Here's another one of the same 18 segments, but between each layer I put a solid layer of Purple Heart. So again, that should give a different pattern. And these two, I just change the pattern and put 2 white and purple, 1 single heart, a Purple Heart, 2 white. So a little bit different pattern. And this is the same thing, but the opposite colors. And again, just glue those back together, rotating each one a slight amount or half a segment. So we'll see what kind of patterns they give. So I got 5 bottom plates for my bowls I'll be making. Each of these will be different, and we'll see what kind of patterns they give on the lathe. So what I'm doing on my lathe is I have a bottom ring, and I'll be cutting a groove in here like this. And then my segment will sit in here. That'll get glued in place. And then I'll probably put like maybe a white maple spacer, and then a Purple Heart on top of it, and then gouge out my bowl. So that's a pattern to set all these up. And eventually I'll put additional layers on here, but I'll do that in the next video series when I'm making the feature rings. So in this video, I'll just be making these 5 base plates. See what they look like with the alternating patterns. I'm using my square tip carbide tool to cut the pockets for the disc, and trying to get a pretty tight fit so they fit pretty snugly in there, but then also that they go all the way down deep enough that the disc sits fully into the cavity I've created. I drilled all the countersunk holes for these 5 pieces. Now I'm ready to start gluing them up. And we'll try and alternate the segments so they're staggered. So I got my base and I got my base here, so I want to stagger those segments. And once again, I'm using Titebond 3 glue and applying glue to both surfaces, both the segmented base and my segmented disc. And again, double checking the alignment of the segments so they do alternate with the base. And then I put some plastic disc on the top and bottom, and then a clamp to clamp the 2 pieces together. I let that dry for at least an hour. After the pieces dry, I put it back on my lathe, then use a sanding block to sand both surfaces, both the base disc and my segmented disc, so they're perfectly flat. So next I'm gluing this 100,000th inch thick maple segmented disc to the surface of my inlaid wood. Once again, I apply Titebond 3 glue to both surfaces, both the base and the segmented thin maple disc. And it's important that I alternate the segments. After double checking the alignment, I apply light pressure with the tailstock. And let that dry for about an hour. After the disc is dry, I'm ready to start turning. And notice I put some lines on the disc. That's for alignment purposes. The outer line there is the outside diameter of my inner disc, so I don't want to get too close to that disc. And then I start gouging out the center to see the patterns that I'm getting from the alternating layers of the segmented disc. So I continue turning, going deeper, down to just touch the top of the last segment of the segmented pieces. And as you can see, I'm starting to get some unique shapes from those segmented layers. And I do some sanding with some 320 grit sandpaper. This is the first of the 18 segmented pattern of alternating maple and Purple Heart disc, in which each of the thin disc layers were staggered back and forth to produce this unique design. This is a design in which the 18 alternating segmented layers were staggered 1/2 of a segment in a clockwise rotation. In this design, a solid Purple Heart layer was inserted between each of the alternating Purple Heart and maple thin disc. In this design, I doubled up on the maple segments and then rotated the disc 1/2 segment between the layers. This completes this video on production of these 5 segmented bases for segmented bowls. So in this video we started out by producing these segmented discs. These are 18 segments of alternating Purple Heart and maple, all going to a perfect point in the center. Then we glued this segmented disc together and then slice it into thin slices, each slice being 50,000 inch thick. Now we can take these discs and glue them back together by rotating them in different directions. So in this first example, I took these segmented discs and I glued them back together, rotating each one 1/2 segment and then gluing them together. And that's what produced this pattern. In a likewise manner, I took these same segmented discs, but instead of rotating them continuously in the same direction, I alternated going back and forth, going to clockwise and then going counterclockwise and then gluing together, and that gave this pattern. Again, very similar, just different rotations of the two discs. I then took the same pattern, but I cut some thin slices of a solid segmented disc, and I just took these same segmented disc, but putting a solid segmented disc between each piece. In other words, I have a segmented alternating disc, then a solid disc, then a segmented disc alternating, then a solid disc, and just kept rotating that. And that gives these different unique patterns once again. And then finally, instead of gluing these together, in this pattern, I took this and I put 2 maple, then a Purple Heart, then 2 maple and a Purple Heart, and just kept rotating that pattern. And likewise, I did 2 Purple Heart, a maple, 2 Purple Heart and a maple, and that gave these unique patterns when they were glued together and rotated. Yeah, I like these two. These would be nice bottoms for bowls. I do have some additional disc here, and my plan on doing these is to cut these up and glue these together, and these will become a top and bottom of either a bell or an egg, which I'll be making in the future. Now these are just the bases for some bowls. I still will be taking these and producing the bowls from these, and I'll be showing those in subsequent videos in which I'll be describing some of the feature rings, which I'll be producing in the feature ring video series. So this is just a start on the various variety of segmented bases that can be made for bowls. I'll be working on a bunch more designs, which I'll be showing in future videos. And once again, if you have any other ideas, please let me know. I'll be adding that to our collection. Once again, thank you for watching this video. If you have any questions, concerns, or comments, as always, please give us a call or drop us an email. And thank you for watching.